Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's really my honor to be here with all of you. I'm very excited about this course. So just to hit on 3 points that are unique about WOW English. So the first one is that it has thematically driven content. And I'm going to go through a unit and explain and show you what I mean by this. But I'll just put all 3 of them out there on the table now because this is the roadmap of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about the thematically driven content. Then we're going to talk about the research-based unit framework. And then we're going to talk about how the units are very user-friendly and scaffolded for teachers, learners, and so parents can also be involved. So we have thematically driven content. So you might ask, why is this important? Why does this matter? Why is this better? Well, it reduces cognitive load. And this is kind of a technical term, but it basically just means that we're not putting a lot of burden on the mind. We're not making the mind jump around and think about different topics which all have different vocabulary and different ideas, because that does creates a lot of work for our minds. So reducing this work, this load on the mind is important because it helps students to retain vocabulary. It also reduces that demand of shifting topics. So if we think about it, if we're talking about WOW English, and then all of a sudden we're going to go talk about science, you sort of think, oh, I have to get out of that mindset and put myself in a different mindset. So this is very important when it comes to language learning, because we want the children or the teenagers to remember this vocabulary and be able to use it again and acquire it meaningfully. So also, it gets to, we allow the students to maximize their thinking skills. So a lot of people are talking these days about critical thinking. They're talking about connecting English to other subjects and to the wider world. So by having this thematic approach, we can go deeper into the topics. We also give them those tools for making those stronger connections. And of course, bringing in critical thinking. So let's take a look at this now. So let's look at chapter 8. It begins on page 116. So our theme is adventure. So how do we show this theme? Well, here we start with personal adventure, something like camping. And we have all of these things related to camping. Then we're connecting it also to other adventure themes, like around the world in 80 days. Here we have Phileas Fogg from classic literature. On the next page, we're still talking about Phileas Fogg. And then on the next page, we bring in Sinbad. So again, all of this is related to adventure. So the Sinbad story is there. Moving on, Sinbad. And once they finish with that, we're still keeping the theme of adventure with the pirates. Then we go to the writing, which has another personal adventure related to camping. The next page, it has a poem which is fantasy adventure, where children pretend to have an adventure. And then on the end, it's still related to the theme of adventure. So the reason why we do this, why is this adventure? You might have people say, oh, well, that's going to be boring. What if they don't like adventure? Well, the idea is that we have multiple angles for the adventure. It's not rigid. The reason why we do it is because this vocabulary that we present at the beginning and the language that comes up throughout gives chances for multiple exposures, repetition of the language, but it's in a meaningful way. Instead of just, everybody, say this word over and over and over again, and then they forget it the next day. So they have multiple exposures to it, and that helps them remember it. So this is why we do this, to facilitate that likelihood that they're going to remember the vocabulary and actually use it. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is that point number 2 from the beginning, the research-based unit framework. So this was especially important to Vishali and to me because we sort of represent the best of both worlds. She, as an Indian educator, has knowledge of the system here. Her background is also in psychology. Me being from the US, I bring an international flavor to it. My background is in linguistics and language acquisition specifically. So these two things work really well together, psychology and language acquisition. So we have, again, this idea of why is this important? Well, psychology research tells us that in terms of difficulty of processing in our minds, we go from listening to speaking to reading to writing. So this represents progression from least difficult to most difficult. And then, because we also have grammar, we have grammar strategically placed throughout so that they're still getting exposure to grammar while they're developing the skills. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. Again, let's go to chapter 8. So you can see that the unit here, chapter 8, begins with this little map up here of the skills. And then we begin with the introduction, the warm-up, and we start with listening. Then we get into phonics fun, which is speaking and pronunciation. We are still speaking over here. Then we get into grammar, which is our language ladder. This is the introduction to grammar. It's the explanation. It's the first time the students see that grammar. So after they see this grammar, we get into the reading. So if you look on the chart, you can see that we've gone from listening to speaking to reading. So here we are, we have our reading. We have our reading. We have our reading questions. Then we do vocabulary practice, in this case idioms. And then you notice here that we bring grammar up again. So we do this because now they're going to practice grammar some more. They may have forgotten all of that grammar because they've done that reading. They're probably not going to get through this reading in one day. It's going to take them a little while, so it's important to give them grammar practice. Then we have another speaking here. This is related to the reading. And then we get into writing. So you can see how we stick to this framework pretty closely. And then if you notice, we bring grammar up at the end. And you may ask, well, why are we bringing it up again? And Vishali describes it as, well, when your battery goes low, you need to plug in and recharge. So we want to make sure that by the time they leave this unit, they have multiple opportunities to practice the grammar, feel comfortable with the grammar in a variety of situations and contexts. Because one of the complaints from teachers is that here I am teaching in year 7 or year 8 and my students still don't know grammar, they're still making mistakes. Well, multiple exposure, the research does tell us that that's important. So hopefully with this structure, they'll have that. Okay, and then I'm going to talk more about the last part of the unit in a little bit. But that's the general overview of how the units are structured. They're all structured like this, and that's something that's different from the competition as I understand.